Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. On today's video, I'm covering how to lift your Volvo a little more. Just like my first video, this method and idea is taken from Adam Nonis on Swede Speed, so if you're interested, please check out his forum post as well as my first video. This video is more about option 2 from his forum post, just some additional suspension work, where that first video is about installing the lift spacers and doing all the work on the car itself. The basic idea here is that you're going to take your strut and you're going to cut your spring seat off so that you can install a coilover sleeve. I originally tried to do this with a Dremel, and it doesn't work well. The Dremel doesn't spin fast enough, and the bits you can buy for it don't work well for grinding down welds. I suggest you go out and you buy a cheap angle grinder from Bellows. It actually came with the grinding disc, so that worked out great. I also have a die grinder that worked really well for sanding down the inside of the coilover sleeves. I picked up a burr bit, which is really good to have, and just a box of sanding flap discs from Amazon. You kind of burn through these, so cheapest option is the best option. From here, I'm actually going to paint these. I live in a snow state. I don't want these to start rusting. I'm worried about corrosion. I'm here, I'm going to seal them up and then get to work on the other front suspension parts. I'm using POR15 to seal up the struts. I've used it on other parts of the car and I have friends that swear by it. There's obviously a variety of products you can use, so just use whatever you're comfortable with or whatever's easiest. For me personally, I did not want to use a spray paint because that causes problems with overspray in my small garage or my driveway. It was just easier to use a brush-on application. If you're getting into building a custom set of coilovers, I'm assuming you know how to paint, so I'm not really going to cover this in detail. If you do have any questions about applying POR15 or any other kind of spray paint, leave it in the comments and I can help you out as best I can. And with that out of the way, let's get back to modifying suspension parts. The other thing that requires modification are your spring seats. These are IPD heavy duty units, but any spring seat will do. Typically, your coilover spring is going to sit in this outer ring here, but because we have these smaller coilover springs, they're going to sit on the inside here. So the basic idea is to just remove some material so that these will sit properly. You can see here that I kind of marked where the flat spot ends on the spring, and so you're trying to make a flat spot for this area of the spring, but you also have to widen this up a little bit for the diameter of the coil spring to fit. So here's the original one, and you can see where the wall of this meets the flat spot. There's a bit of a radiused edge there, and so we're just trying to get rid of that as well as take a little bit of material off the side. You can see here on the modified one, the difference that is made. You can kind of see this edge here. It's a little rough around here. And I got a little overzealous here and took too much of the rubber off, so I'm exposing some of the metal. A die grinder works great for this job as well. The burr bit is way better than any Dremel bit. The Dremel, again, just doesn't really spin fast enough, and even though this is rubber, it's really heavy duty rubber, really thick, and so it'll just take you forever with a Dremel. If you're looking for a reason to go buy a die grinder, this is it. This job will also be way easier with a bench vise. I took these couple clips on the toolbox holding it by hand just because it was better for filming, but I ultimately did the whole thing in the bench vise. Trying to hold the spring seat and hold the die grinder at the same time just doesn't work. You gotta secure the spring seat down and then you can focus on using the tool. Ultimately, just take your time, go back and forth, check the spring fitment, take a little more off. If you take too much off, you're going to buy a new spring seat. So here's the final product. The spring sits securely in the seat. It's not going anywhere. Especially once it's assembled, you're going to be totally fine. So here I've got one strut assembled, and I just wanted to cover the couple differences between mine and the one that Adam built on his forum post. His didn't include bump stops and dust covers. While I'm not really sure how much they matter, I wanted to include them on mine because that's how a typical strut is put together. The biggest issue is that your stock dust boot doesn't work with the I-box spring because the I-box spring is too small a diameter, so you have to go find something else. In my initial searching, you can't really search for a dust boot by size, but I found this company called Godspeed. They sell on Amazon and eBay, and they sell a pack of 2 dust boots and 2 bump stops. And while the dust boot fits diameter-wise, it's a little too short lengthwise. So I kept searching, I bought a couple parts, couldn't really find anything that worked. And then I found these Öhlins dust boots, and I can leave the part number for them in the description, but these will work. They fit diameter-wise, and as you can see, they fit lengthwise. If you want, you can actually stretch these out and fit them over the top of the body of the shock here. I didn't do that. I'm not really sure if you want to, but you can if you want because there's a little bit of give to them compared to these, which are plastic. I did end up using the bump stop from the Godspeed set, so even though the dust boot didn't work, this did, and I can show you guys a close-up of that here. These grooves here are pretty much the same diameter as the top of the dust boot. And if you slide this up through, it interfaces perfectly with that little groove. And now it's not going anywhere. So that's why I've secured it to the top of the strut, and I know that this boot isn't going anywhere. This dust boot will actually stretch and fit over the top of the body of the shock, but I'm not really sure you want to do that. There are drainage holes here, but it's still gonna allow stuff to sit beneath that. And every strut boot that you look at usually ends before the body. So that's how I left it on this shock that I built back here. I don't think you want it sealed. Again, you can if you want to, but this is how I left it. So as far as the bump stop goes, this inner diameter is really close to the diameter of the piston. Takes a little bit of force to get it on there. But as you can see, it's not gonna go anywhere once it's on there. And then this thick strut washer slides right on the top, just like it's supposed to. That's also gonna keep this from going up once you install the star nut. Overall, I think this will serve its intended purpose as a bump stop does, just an extra safety measure to make sure you don't bottom out the shock. It's not like I'm planning on going real crazy with this car, so I'm not really worried about bottoming out the front suspension, but you never know, rough roads, some kind of off-roading, whatever it might be, I have that peace of mind that it's on here. Based off the size of the stock bump stop, I don't think that this one needs to be trimmed. Maybe someone knows better than me, please comment if you do, but I've been driving the car around and I haven't had any problems. Now it's time to assemble all the parts. I didn't cover modification of the coilover sleeves because it might not always be necessary. For me, I had to sand out the inner diameter for them to get to fit over the strut. Other people I talked to didn't have to, and when I talked to Adam about it, he had kind of a mixed bag. Besides the coilover sleeve over the body of the shock and that lower spring perch, it's really just building a stock Volvo strut. At the end of the clip, you can see me measuring the distance from the spring perch to the spring seat. I'm just making sure that the perches are spun up the same amount on both struts. Next, I'm going to cover what spring you should use and where that spring perch should sit. For this part of the video, I had originally done a bunch of research on coilovers, preload, where that lower spring perch should be, and how I could accurately tell you where to put it on your suspension. Essentially, none of that mattered, so I'm going to tell you my experience and what did end up mattering. To put it quickly and easily, if you're replacing the rear springs and shocks, the Nivamats, I think you need 12-inch tall springs for the front. The 10-inch tall springs aren't going to cut it. I'd originally gone with the 10-inch spring, that's what you're looking at here, but when I installed everything and the car settled out, the rear was way too high, the front was way too low, and there was just too much rake on the car. It didn't look how I wanted it to, even with that lower perch spun all the way up. So that's when I ordered the 12-inch spring, figured I would try that, and that fixed my problem. Ultimately, you're going to have to decide what's right for you. For me, I wanted to replace the rear springs and shocks while I was in there because that rear suspension is just a pain to work with. I did not want to have to go back and deal with it later. If that's your plan, I say go with the 12-inch. If your plan is to leave that stuff alone and just install the spacers, go with the 10-inch and it should be totally fine. I can say it's been a few months and thousands of miles since I did the work and this video is coming out and the suspension hasn't settled out in some weird way. I don't have reverse rake or anything like that because the front springs are too tall. The one thing I can tell you for certain is that final adjustments will have to be done on the car itself. You're going to have to drive the car around, let everything settle, and then make that final adjustment. So make sure you get that little wrench and you can adjust that spring perch while it's still on the car. I just wanted to share my experience with the spring length. I'm not saying that Adam's forum post is wrong or incorrect. It's just what worked on his car, and this is what worked on my car. If you do have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. I can try to help you out, but every car is different, and that's what makes this a tough call to make. Now on to some general assembly points. Again, the other video is better suited for this. I'm just going to gloss over things here. That one goes into more detail. Essentially, the front is just swapping out struts. Once you've got it all built, take the old one out, put the new one in, match everything up, and it should go in without a problem. Even if you're not replacing the springs, you still have to remove them to add that spacer to the top. That additional bottom spacer is talked about in that first video. And onto the shocks, those get remounted from the bottom of the control arm to the top of the control arm. So you have to remove those as well. Again, that's kind of why I just replaced them while I was in here. They're old, I might as well do it while I had it all apart. Here's an overview of what it'll look like. Everything's not assembled yet, but it's all in place. So you've got the control arm, the shock mount, and then that bracket on top. It's all the same length of stuff, it's just in a different order, so the nuts will thread onto the studs, no problem. You can see that spring spacer on top. You can't see the one on the bottom, but that's also there too. And once that's all in place, you can go ahead and tighten everything back up. And that about wraps things up. Again, I know I glossed over a lot of the installation and things like that. That first video is best suited for that. I didn't want to have a bunch of repeat information on top of all of the unique build parts of this. The very last thing I want to touch on is the ride quality, and that's because it's the same as stock. You'd honestly never know it's any different. It rides just as well as it did stock. I daily this car. I have no issues with it. I love it. There's no rubbing. There's no weird suspension clunks or quirks about it. It's just sitting higher than it was when it was stock. So if you have any concerns like that, I wouldn't even worry about it. I'd go ahead, throw the lift on, and enjoy that extra ground clearance. I just want to say a huge thank you to Adam for figuring all this stuff out in the first place, manufacturing and selling those spacers to everyone who's bought a set, and answering a bunch of questions I had when doing this work both times. Thanks so much for checking out the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it helpful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. I try to answer everybody. And if you like this, think about subscribing. It really helps the channel out. Thanks, everybody.